Welcome to AP Biology. In this video, we are going to show you step-by-step instructions on how to design your own lab experiment and write a thorough lab report.
To do this, we will be designing an experiment testing homeostasis. Homeostasis essentially is the body's way of regulating internal conditions to stay relatively constant. For example, if the weather is extremely hot, an organism has mechanisms like sweating to cool down the body. For simpler experimental purposes, we're going to focus on the body's recovery responses to some forms of physical activity. But first, let's review the 8 steps in creating a successful lab.
In step 1, it's important to have a general understanding of the big idea, in this case, homeostasis. We reviewed briefly on what homeostasis is, but it's always good to review and look more in depth on the concept. Having a better understanding might help you in the next step.
The question is what you are asking, what things you are wanting to test in the experiment. It's good to keep in mind the independent variable, IV, and dependent variables, DV, so you are focused on your task.
The hypothesis is in an if-then format. If the independent variable, IV, does, then the dependent variable, DV, will. Keep in mind the results from this experiment will prove or nullify your hypothesis.
Step 4 is your experimental design. This was our lab setup. Make sure all aspects of the diagram are clearly labeled. Be sure to establish your constants and controlled variables through all trials. The control group, the trial with only constant variables, is used for comparison to the experimental groups.
Step 5 is the procedure. It's important to be detailed and specific as possible so the experiment can be recreated. Minute. Let's take the initial pulse. Stop.
Step 6. You record the data in an organized, labeled table. Step 7 is the analysis, graphing the data collected appropriately. Some experiments might depict the data more clearly with a line graph or using a bar graph. In our homeostasis example, a line graph fits best because it shows the change over time.
Step 8 is the conclusion. A typical conclusion is anywhere from 1 to 2 full pages. It may seem like a lot, but by completing the 4 key parts, summary, evidence, reasoning, and reflection, you will have completed a thorough conclusion with ease.
The summary is an overview of your experiment, restating your hypothesis and procedure to test it. Also, state if your data supports or rejects your hypothesis.
The evidence section is a summary explanation of each piece of data, measurement, and observation.
Reasoning ties part A and B together. You must analyze and explain why the evidence supports or rejects your hypothesis.
The last step is reflection, where you recognize any possible uncontrollable sources of error that could have affected your results. Then come up with other questions that you would like to test on this concept in the future.